This is a T90 Prorыв, and this is a Russian BMD-4. In this photo, you can see the loading of the 9M729 missile, which is used in the Iskander-M complex. And here you can see the wreckage of the Orlan 10 drone. Of course, you may ask me, Maria, why are you showing us Russian equipment and ammunition? Surely, anyone interested in the Russian-Ukrainian war has seen photos of Russian equipment multiple times. But what if I told you that all this equipment, apart from belonging to the Russian army, is bound by the fact that they necessarily contain high-tech parts and devices made in Europe and the US? I'm Maria Drutska, and in this video we are going to delve into the world of military technologies, weapons, and the impact of sanctions on the Russian military-industrial complex. In response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the West has imposed a series of sectoral sanctions on Russia's economy, which has significantly hit the raw materials-based economy of the aggressor country. One of the first to be hit was the military-industrial complex of Russia, responsible for the production of weapons that have caused many civilian and military casualties in Ukraine. Let's start from the beginning. Back in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea and the start of the undeclared war, the Council of Europe jointly decided to embargo the supply of military technologies to Russia, as well as components and devices. Like most sanctions of that period, they of course hurt Russia, but this damage was minimal due to two important aspects. First, the embargo did not apply to contracts they were signed before July 2014. What does it mean? Manufacturers of components simply signed an additional agreement within the framework of the contract signed before 2014 and continued to trade directly with Russian military-industrial complex enterprises. At most, what was done to circumvent sanctions, intermediary companies were created in third countries, through which goods and technologies were passed. Secondly, due to the absence of clear definitions, some goods could be classified as dual-purpose items. For instance, a European company might supply microchips for vacuum cleaners, but how those microchips were used in Russia is another story entirely. In all fairness, I have to say that despite the war in Donbass and the occupied Crimea, Russian components were delivered to Ukraine and vice versa, and Ukraine supplied certain equipment to Russia as well. Now let's talk about the Russian defense industry under real sanctions. Despite the restrictions that were imposed after February 24, 2022, Russian authorities pompously declared that despite some difficulties caused by the sanctions, Russian industry is coping with the existing challenges. In reality, the situation is far from this, and this is primarily due to systematic problems that have been exacerbated since the introduction of sanctions. As it happened, the Soviet and then Russian defense industry was largely trailing the West in most sectors. The progressive solutions that have emerged over the past decades are thanks to Western technologies, and the cessation of contracts already has significant consequences. For instance, Russian Baikal and Elbrus processors, which were supposed to be alternatives to Intel and AMD, were actually manufactured in Taiwan at the TSMC company, which has refused to cooperate with Russia. Russian companies Baikal, MCST Yadro, and STC module, due to technical limitations and the complexity of the process, only designed chips. And this was despite the financial resources available in Russia. Now, MCST, the developer of Elbrus processors, has stated that it has begun negotiations with the Russian factory Micron about transferring production from Taiwan to the factory in Zelenograd. However, this does not solve the existing problems in the field of high technologies. Firstly, Micron itself under the sanctions. Secondly, the technological capabilities that are available at this enterprise are far from those at TSMC. Thirdly, it will not be possible to achieve the basic minimum quality and technical capabilities provided at the Taiwanese enterprise. And if it suddenly happens, the cost of the chips obtained will be several times higher compared to similar analogs. And here is the worst nothing that these processors were targeted by Russian state structure and the defense industry. This means that the production of such high-tech weapons as air and sea-based cruise missiles, modern air defense systems, electronic warfare systems will have significant problems. The fact that the Russian army has already significantly reduced the use of Iskanders and calibers and is switching to old missile weapons, including Ha-22 missiles and others, indicates that problem indeed exists. But before we go on, I would like to ask you, please like this video, and if you enjoy my videos and think they are useful, consider supporting this channel through Patreon or buy me a coffee, as this allows me to continue making these videos for you. Let's not forget about the significant impact of the sanctions on the personnel potential of the industry. With the onset of the war, Russia began to experience a massive brain drain. Not without reason, the government of the aggressor country in April started promising gold mountains and everything else to Russian IT specialists so they wouldn't leave the country. It's hard to believe in the figure about 85% of those who left returning to the country after the adoption of a series of incentive laws. In addition, a recent witch hunt initiated by special services against scientists involved in the development of hypersonic weapons will not stimulate talent IT use to dedicate themselves to serving an unpredictable regime. Another serious threat to the development of the Russian defense industry is the gradual loss of its position in the arms export market. In 2020, according to SIPRI, Russian companies reduced the volume of export sales by 6.5% to $26.4 billion, continuing the downward trend observed since 2018. But after the demonstration of Russian weapons capabilities on the battlefield in Ukraine, the export problem has only worsened. For example, India first decided to terminate the contract of the purchase of Mi-17 V5 helicopters, then froze agreement for the purchase of Ka-31 helicopters, and later the Philippines also refused to buy Mi-17 transport helicopters. The decline in export earnings against the backdrop of an already glaring deficit in the Russian budget, and the oil embargo has not even taken effect yet, will deprive Russian enterprises of working capital. It is unlikely that the situation will be improved by additional investments of 600-700 billion rubles, about $10 billion, which were announced in June. It's probably that most of this money will be directed to the repair of equipment damaged in Ukraine and to repay of debts from previous periods. Over time, with the noticeable depreciation of Russian weapons on the battlefields in Ukraine, all the problems mentioned above will increase. And although some Russian companies have stockpiled imported components, they tend to get exhausted. Here, a quick reorientation to China or India will hardly help the aggressor. Firstly, there are quality issues, and second, there are risks for Chinese and Indian companies to fall under international ban themselves. The US has already unambiguously hinted at such prospects by including 5 Chinese companies in the blacklist in June, which continued to trade with Russians. Similar measures were applied apply to the companies from Pakistan, UAE, Vietnam, and others. Thirdly, China at the state level is hardly interested in the technological strengthening of its raw materials satellite. Undoubtedly, Russians will not refuse to use the smuggling mechanism created after 2014 for laundering components through third countries, but now this will be difficult as supervision by the relevant US and EU bodies over such equipment has significantly increased. Meanwhile, from the high Russian tribunes, mantras about a decade of advancement over the West in terms of military technology will continue to echo, accompanied by circus performance of combat robots purchased for a few $1,000s on the AliExpress platform. Let's summarize. Sanctions directed at the Russian defense industry are working. Do they work completely and fully? Yes and no. Russians find loopholes to import necessary components, but the quantity of these components has significantly decreased, and their price has increased. The price increase is linked to risk for the importing company, a markup on the goods, and an increase in the chain of necessary manipulations when buying the product. In addition, in the 11th sanctions package, sanctions will be imposed against third companies supplying sanctioned products to Russia. This will allow closing the loopholes for import from third countries and reduce the number of suppliers. See you in my next videos.